The moment Clara Dugan rode through the split-rail fence she had not been invited to cross, she had no idea she was about to change the life of the most stubborn, closed-off man in all of Colorado territory. It was the spring of 1874, and the land around Ridgecrest Flats was the kind of beautiful that made a person forget, just for a moment, that survival out here was never guaranteed. The prairie stretched wide and gold-green under a sky so blue it looked painted, and the distant mountains still wore their white caps like old men who refused to take off their hats indoors. It was the kind of morning that made you want to believe in second chances, even if you had long since stopped believing in such things. Levi Fairchild was 31 years old and had not believed in second chances for nearly 5 years. He was out by the east pasture when he heard her coming, the sound of a horse moving too fast, the kind of pace that meant trouble or desperation or both. He straightened from where he had been checking a section of fence post that had loosened overnight, pushed the brim of his hat up with one finger, and turned to look. The sun was behind her, which meant he got the silhouette first, a woman on a dark bay horse, riding harder than anyone had a right to ride across private land, her dark hair coming loose from whatever she had pinned it with, streaming behind her like a banner of pure reckless urgency. He did not move toward her. He did not call out. He simply stood there with his fence tool in hand and waited, because in his experience, whatever trouble was riding toward you at that speed was going to arrive whether you ran toward it or away from it. She pulled the horse up hard about 20 yards from where he stood, and the animal's hooves threw up a spray of dark spring soil. The woman took one look at him standing there with his arms crossed over his chest and his jaw set like a man who had not smiled in a very long time, and she said, breathless, "I am sorry. I know this is your land. I will explain, I promise, but I need to know first, do you have water? My horse has been running since before dawn, and I cannot ask her for another mile without it." Levi looked at the horse. The animal's sides were heaving, and there was foam at the bit. Whatever he thought about uninvited strangers cutting across his fence line, he was not the kind of man who let a good horse suffer for it. "Trough is by the barn," he said, and that was all. Clara Dugan swung down from the saddle with practiced ease, not waiting for him to offer a hand or lead the way. She was not the kind of woman who waited. She walked the horse toward where the barn roof was visible just past a stand of cottonwoods, and Levi followed at a distance that made it clear he was not following because he wanted to, but because it was his property and he had a right to know what was happening on it. She was younger than he had initially thought, perhaps 24 or 25, with a face that was trail-worn and sun-kissed in the way of someone who spent real time outdoors, not the theatrical tan of someone performing a life of adventure. Her clothes were practical, a dark canvas riding skirt, a cotton blouse that might have started the day tucked in neatly sturdy boots that had seen significant use. She wore no jewelry except for a small locket at her throat that caught the morning light when she moved. She led the horse to the water trough with the calm confidence of someone who knew horses deeply, speaking to the animal in low, reassuring tones as it drank. Levi leaned against the barn wall and watched. "You going to tell me what you are running from?" he asked. She looked up at him steadily. Her eyes were a deep, honest brown, the kind that did not hide things well even when the person behind them was trying to. "3 men, hired by a man named Douglas Crail. He is a land agent out of Pueblo, and he has decided that a piece of land my father left me and his will is better off in his possession." "Your father's land," Levi said. Not a question. He was measuring the situation, the way a man measures anything he has not decided what to do with yet. "My father was Thomas Dugan. He settled a quarter section about 12 miles east of here, near Crail's Creek, though Crail did not name it. My father worked it, and the name just stuck along the way because of the proximity to Crail's existing holdings." She smoothed her hand along her horse's neck, watching the animal drink. "My father died 8 months ago. Fever. I was in Denver taking care of business for him. He had always trusted me with the practical side of things, since I was the only one of his children who had any head for numbers and contracts. She paused. My brother Eli is a good man, but paperwork and ledgers make his eyes go glazed. And Crail wants the land, Levi said. Crail has wanted the land for 3 years. He made offers to my father that my father refused politely each time. My father was not a man who frightened easily, but he was also not a man who looked for fights. He just wanted to farm his piece of ground and be left alone. Her voice was steady, but something moved behind her eyes when she spoke of her father, something that had not finished grieving yet. When he died, Crail made an offer to me, and I refused it, and then the offer stopped and the men started. Riders cutting across my fence lines, water being diverted. 2 weeks ago, one of them burned my father's barn. Levi was quiet for a moment. The horse had finished drinking and was breathing more evenly. Clara scratched behind the animal's ears with the absent affection of long familiarity. "Why are you on my land?" he asked. "You said 12 miles east. That is the wrong direction if you are heading toward any kind of law." "I know exactly where I am," she said, and there was no defensiveness in it, just certainty. "I am heading to Ridgecrest because there is a telegraph office there, and I need to send word to a lawyer in Pueblo who has agreed to take my case. The men Crail sent were on the trail I usually take. I went off trail about 9 miles back." She met his eyes again, direct and unapologetic. "I am sorry I crossed your fence line without permission. I will repair any damage the crossing caused." "One rail came loose," he said. "I can fix a fence rail," she nodded. "Then I will pay for the trouble. I do not want your money." He pushed off the barn wall and looked at the sky, checking the sun's position the way men who have spent years outdoors do automatically, without thinking. Those men who were on the trail, if they are hired riders who know this territory, they will know the alternate routes well enough. Cutting through Fairchild land is not exactly a secret among people who know the county. She had not told him her name yet, and he had not told her his, and they were already deep into the mechanics of her trouble. "That was the West for you. Pleasantries came after survival." "My name is Clara Dugan," she said. "Levi Fairchild." He settled his hat back down and looked out toward the east pasture, thinking. "How many rounds did you say they were?" "3. One I recognized, a man named Aldous, wide through the shoulders, rides a gray. He is the one Crail sends when he wants something done thoroughly." Levi knew the type. He had encountered men like Aldous Crane before, not the impulsive, violent ones, but the methodical kind, the ones who followed orders with the steady patience of a man who had turned cruelty into a profession. Those were the ones you had to watch. "I will take you to Ridgecrest," he said. She blinked. Whatever she had been expecting, it was not that. "You do not have to do that. I am aware of that." He turned and walked toward the barn's main doors. "My horse needs saddling. Yours needs another 10 minutes of rest before she moves again. I will be ready in 15. He disappeared into the dim interior of the barn, and Clara stood with her horse in the morning light, and for just a moment, the tension that had been holding her upright since before sunrise shifted slightly, not disappearing, but loosening at the edges like a knot that has been worried by careful hands. Inside the barn, Levi worked with the efficient movements of a man long accustomed to working alone. He pulled his saddle from the rack and set it on his horse, a big-bodied roan he called Marshall, not for any romantic reason, but because the animal had a habit of appearing wherever Levi least expected it, which was the same quality Levi associated with law enforcement, and the name had stuck. He checked Marshall's hooves, tightened the cinch, checked it again. His hands moved on their own while his mind did its own separate work. He did not know why he had offered to take her to Ridgecrest. He told himself it was because any decent person would do the same. He told himself it was because Douglas Crail was a man he had heard of and had no particular regard for, a land agent who operated in the gray spaces between legal and unethical, and who had used those gray spaces to squeeze smaller landowners off good ground for as long as Levi had been paying attention to such things. He told himself it was nothing to do with the way she had looked at him, without any trace of the calculation or performance he had grown accustomed to seeing in people who wanted something from him. He told himself a lot of things in those 15 minutes, and he believed perhaps half of them. 5 years ago, a woman named Eleanor Marsh had made him believe in every possible good thing, and then she had left Ridgecrest with a traveling merchant named Garrett Poole on a Tuesday morning without saying a word to Levi, except what was contained in a letter. He had read so many times he could recite it from memory, but had eventually burned because carrying it any further seemed like a form of voluntary suffering he no longer needed to participate in. Eleanor had said she loved him. Eleanor had taken the ring he had saved for. Eleanor had said the life he was offering, the land, the quiet, the work was not the life she had imagined for herself, and she was sorry, and she hoped he understood. He had understood. He just had not recovered from it the way he supposed he should have by now. He had built his vow to stay alone with the same careful deliberateness with which he built everything on his property, fence post by fence post, plank by plank, practical and unsentimental, and meant to last. He was not a man given to dramatic declarations, even private ones. He had simply decided, quietly and with great certainty, that love was a thing that happened to other people, and that he was better suited to the company of horses and wide open land than to any endeavor that required him to trust someone that completely again. He had kept that vow for 5 years without much difficulty. He led Marshall out of the barn and found Clara Dugan standing in nearly the same spot he had left her, but her eyes had traveled to the house. A solid, well-kept structure of squared timber and stone, with a wide porch and straight lines that spoke of a man who took care of what was his. She turned when she heard the horse and said nothing about the house, but he had the sense she had noticed things. "Ready," he said. "Ready," she agreed, and mounted her horse with that same unhurried efficiency. They rode east in the bright morning, and for the first mile or so neither of them spoke. The land between Levi's property and the main trail into Ridgecrest rolled in gentle waves of grassland interrupted by occasional stands of pine and the silver thread of a creek that ran down from the foothills. A pair of hawks turned lazy circles overhead. The kind of quiet that settles around two people who are each deciding how much they need to know about the other was not uncomfortable exactly, but it had weight. Clara spoke first. "How long have you had this land?" 7 years. Bought it from a man named Osborne who had decided the territory was less hospitable than advertised. Levi kept his eyes on the tree line to the east. He was not wrong, but the land itself is good. It is the people that are sometimes the problem. What do you run on it? Cattle mostly, some horses, enough hay to get through winter. He glanced at her sideways. You said your father farmed his quarter section. What kind of farming? He planted winter wheat and tried his hand at corn in the lower fields near the creek. The soil there is good, rich and dark, not the sandy stuff you get further north. He had some livestock too, a few dairy cows, chickens. It was not a large operation, but it was entirely his. She paused. It is mine now, and Eli's technically, by the terms of the will. Eli is up north working a cattle drive this season, and I have been managing things alone. I did not write to tell him about Crail's men, because Eli would come home immediately and do something rash, and I needed to handle it properly. Handle it properly, Levi repeated, something in his voice not exactly mockery but carrying the trace of a man who has learned that proper handling is a thing the powerful rarely respect. And the lawyer in Pueblo, he is confident in your claim. The deed is clean. My father's name is on it, and the title transfers by will without contest. Crail's argument is that there were survey errors in the original land description, which there were not, and anyone who looks at the actual survey documents will see that immediately. Her horse moved easy beside his now, the animal recovered from the morning's hard run and settling into a comfortable road-eating walk. The problem is that proper legal process takes time, and Crail apparently has run out of patience for it. The barn he burned. Yes. Was anyone in it? No, I got the animals out. He chose his timing carefully. It was early morning, I was up, and I think he wanted me to see it burning without being able to stop it rather than wanting to hurt anyone." She said this matter-of-factly, but there was a controlled anger underneath it that Levi could hear clearly, the kind of anger that a person has been carrying long enough that it has become part of the load rather than an acute crisis. They rode in silence again for a stretch. The trail into Ridgecrest was visible now, a pale ribbon cutting through the grass, and Levi scanned both directions before they joined it. Nothing moved on the road in either direction. "We should make town inside 2 hours at this pace," he said. "Thank you," she said, and unlike the earlier, more formal apologies, this one came from somewhere more unguarded. "I mean that sincerely. You did not have to do this." "I know," he said again, and that was all, and somehow it was enough. Ridgecrest Flats in 1874 was not a large settlement by any definition the eastern states might have applied to the word, but it was a working town with a purpose to it. The main street ran about 3 blocks long and held, among other things, a general mercantile, a blacksmith, a small hotel called the Westing House, a saloon that also served as a meeting hall, a church that had been built the previous year with lumber donated by 3 of the larger ranches in the county, a doctor's office, and the telegraph office that was Clara Dugan's immediate destination. They rode in without incident, which Levi had not entirely expected. He tied both horses at the rail in front of the mercantile and followed her to the telegraph office, where a thin young man named Albert, who operated the equipment, looked up with the mild expression of someone who had learned not to be surprised by whatever walked through his door. Clara composed her message to the lawyer in Pueblo, a man named Franklin Hurst, with the focus of someone who had been composing it in her head for the last 12 miles and knew exactly what she needed to say. She gave the bare bones of it. The situation was escalating. She needed Hurst to file for an injunction immediately. She would send her full written account by post today and needed his response at the Ridgecrest telegraph office within 3 days. Albert sent it, took her payment, and told her that messages came through most reliably in the afternoon when the line traffic was lighter. Outside, the morning had moved well toward midday, and the town was settling into its usual rhythm. Levi stood on the boardwalk with his thumbs hooked in his belt and looked out at the street while Clara collected herself. And then she came out beside him and stood there for a moment with the sun on her face. "I need to post a letter," she said, "and I need to arrange accommodations for a few days while I wait for Hurst's response." "The Westing House is decent enough," he said. "Margaret Oakes runs it and she keeps the rooms clean and the meals regular. Is there somewhere I can send word to my property? I have a hired hand named Bert who has been there since I left this morning, and he will worry. The post is next to the telegraph office. You can write to Bert today and it will go out with tomorrow morning's delivery, but that will take time. Faster would be to send word with the stage. It passes through Dugan land twice a week, and Bert likely knows the driver." She considered this. "The stage runs again tomorrow morning. Day after." She nodded, working through logistics the way a person does when they are accustomed to managing things on their own. Levi found himself watching the side of her face and looked deliberately away. They spent the next hour attending to the practical matters, Clara writing to Bert, posting the letter to Hurst, settling her room at the Westing House. Levi accompanied her to each stop, and at no point asked himself clearly why he was still there rather than riding back to the work waiting on his property. He told himself it was because he knew the town better than she did, and it made practical sense to see her settled. He told himself it was because Crail's men might still be in the area. Both of these things were true. Neither of them was the whole truth. When they were done, they stood in front of the Westing House and Clara looked at him with an expression he could not quite read. "Let me buy you a meal," she said. "It is past noon and you have ridden 24 miles on my account today." He nearly said no. The word was right there, automatic and available, the way refusals had become automatic for him over the past 5 years. He opened his mouth and said, "All right," and that surprised him enough that he spent the first part of their meal at the small restaurant adjoining the hotel, occupied with the puzzle of why he had agreed. The meal was simple roasted beef, potatoes, bread that was still warm, and they ate it with the unself-conscious appetite of people who had been up since before dawn and moving hard. Between bites, they talked, the way strangers talk when they have already been through something together that bypasses the usual stages of cautious introduction. She told him about growing up on the Dugan land, how her father had come out from Missouri in the early 1860s when the territory was still being mapped, and had chosen his quarter section for the quality of the water as much as the soil. How she had learned to ride before she could reliably stay on a horse, and had spent several years being thrown before the riding took proper hold. How her mother had died when Clara was 12, a fact she delivered with the same composed steadiness with which she seemed to handle all the hard things, and how after that it had been Thomas Dugan and his 2 children, Eli and Clara, making the land work together. Levi told her less about himself, because he was not a man who talked easily about his own life, but she did not push. She received what he offered: the 7 years on the property, the cattle operation, the fact that he had grown up in Kansas before the territory called him west, and she did not press the edges of what he did not say, which he found, to his own surprise, restful. By the time they had finished eating, and he had refused to let her pay despite her insistence, and had paid for them both with the quiet finality of a man who has made a decision and will not revisit it, the afternoon light was coming in at a slant through the restaurant windows, and he knew he needed to get back to his property before dark. He stood to leave, and she stood too, and they walked out together to where his horse was tied. "I am grateful," she said, standing on the boardwalk with her arms at her sides and the afternoon light doing something complicated to the color of her hair, "more than I can say properly." "You do not need to say it properly," he told her. "You said it fine." "Will you?" She stopped, reconsidered something, then continued. "Would it be possible for me to call on you when I leave town, to let you know how it resolves? I feel I owe you that much at least, an accounting of what happened after you helped." He looked at her for a moment. The vow he had built and kept had never felt fragile to him before, 5 years of fences standing solid. He looked at Clara Dugan's honest brown eyes and the direct, unapologetic way she stood waiting for his answer, and he felt something that was neither welcome nor entirely unwelcome, a small shift at the foundation of something he had built to last. "You know where the property is," he said. "I do," she said. "I rode across it this morning uninvited." And there it was, the smallest suggestion of a smile at the corner of her mouth, not a coy smile or a practiced one, but the real and slightly rueful variety that comes from a person who can see the absurdity in their own situation. It arrived and was gone quickly, but he had seen it. He rode home in the slanting afternoon and did not think about her much. He thought about her quite a lot. The next 3 days on his property moved with the usual unhurried labor of a working cattle operation in spring fence repair, herd checks, the ongoing project of clearing the irrigation channel on the north side of the property that had silted up over the winter. His hired hand, a young man of 22 named Pete Halley, who had been working for Levi for 2 years, and who had the quality of doing exactly what was asked without adding unnecessary commentary, noticed nothing different about his employer except possibly that Levi was checking the eastern road more frequently than usual, and Pete had enough sense not to mention it. On the 4th day, Clara Dugan rode through the main gate, the actual main gate this time, not through a gap in the fence line, and Levi was on the porch with his morning coffee when he saw her coming. He set the coffee down on the rail and waited. She looked better than she had 4 days ago, rested, her hair pinned properly, wearing the same practical riding clothes but with the trail-worn desperation replaced by something that was simply how she looked when circumstances were not driving her across unfamiliar land at dawn. She pulled up at the gate and he walked down from the porch to meet her. "Hurst responded," she said, before he could speak. "He filed the injunction 2 days ago." A federal judge in Denver has accepted the case and issued a temporary restraining order against Crail and anyone acting on his behalf from approaching my property or interfering with my operations in any way. She said it with a controlled, careful relief, the way a person announces good news when they are not yet entirely certain good news is going to hold. It is not finished, of course. There will be hearings. But for now, Crail's hands are legally tied. That is good news, Levi said. It is very good news. She swung down from the saddle and stood holding her horse's reins, and something softened slightly in her expression. I wanted to tell you myself. You were part of how this started to resolve. All I did was ride to town. You rode to town with me, and that made a difference. She looked at him steadily, not letting him minimize it. My father always said that the kindness of people who have no obligation to be kind is the realest kind there is. I think he was right. There was a silence that had a different quality to it than their earlier silences. Earlier there had been urgency pulling at the edges of everything, trouble crowding out the space for anything else. Now there was nothing in particular pressing, just the spring morning and the two of them standing at the gate of his property with no pressing reason for her to be there except that she had wanted to come. "Do you want coffee?" he asked. She blinked. "That would be very welcome." He led her horse to the hitching post near the porch, and they sat on the wide steps with cups of coffee and the morning stretching out in front of them. And the conversation that followed was different from the functional, problem-solving exchanges of their first day. They talked about the land, both of their respective pieces of it, the particular challenges of working soil in the territory, the differences between raising cattle and farming crops, the way the weather could be extraordinary and catastrophic within the same week out here. Clara talked about her plans for the property now that the legal situation was stabilizing. She wanted to repair the barn, obviously, and she had been thinking for some time about whether to try leasing some of the lower fields to a farmer friend of her father's who had more hands than land. Levi listened to her think through problems in real time, the way she approached a practical challenge from 3 or 4 angles before settling on the most reasonable one. He recognized the way she thought. It was the way he thought, not grand or romantic, but thorough, grounded, built on what was actually there rather than what you wished was there. He refilled her coffee without asking, and she thanked him without making it into anything more than thanks. And then she stayed for another hour, and when she finally rose to leave, he realized that the morning had gone quickly in a way that mornings on his own land almost never did anymore. "I should let you get back to your work," she said. "I can afford a morning," he said, and it surprised him again, the ease of it. She smiled properly this time, not the small, careful suggestion of one but a full and genuine expression that changed the whole landscape of her face, and she said, "Thank you, Levi," and mounted her horse and rode out through the main gate at a comfortable walk, not the desperate hard riding of 4 days ago, and he watched her go from the porch steps with his coffee cup in his hands and the warm spring air around him. Pete appeared from behind the barn looking entirely too casual. "Who was that?" he asked. "Someone I helped get to town last week," Levi said. "Pretty," Pete observed. "Go fix the north fence," Levi said, but the word hung in the air for a moment longer than Levi would have preferred. She came back the following week. This time she did not have news, or at least not the kind that required immediate delivery. She had a basket covered with a cloth, and she came to the gate and called out, and when he came she said, with the directness that he was beginning to understand was simply how she was, "I baked bread yesterday and made too much of it, and Bert does not eat as much as he lets on. I thought you might use some." He stood at the gate looking at the basket and then at her. "You rode 8 miles to bring me bread." 12, she corrected. "I went by way of the trail this time rather than through your fence." Something moved through him that he refused to examine directly. He took the basket. "You want coffee?" I would not say no. So she stayed for 2 hours that Tuesday, and then the following Friday she came again with no offering, but simply because she said she had been going over the survey documents for her property, and had some questions about the way the eastern boundary was described, and she had heard in town that Levi Fairchild knew the county's survey history better than most because he had been involved in an adjacent land dispute some years back. He had in fact been involved in exactly that, and he knew the survey records well, and they sat at his kitchen table with the documents spread between them, and he walked her through the technical language with the patient thoroughness of a man who understands a subject completely and has enough respect for the person across from him not to condescend. She followed everything immediately. Her questions were precise and revealing. She understood what she was looking at and was using his knowledge to fill in the specific gaps in her own, not asking him to carry her through something she had not tried to understand herself. He found this more than merely tolerable. He found it genuinely engaging, sitting at his own kitchen table with the survey maps and her clear-eyed attention and the smell of his wood stove and the comfortable working quiet of two people who thought similarly. When they were done, she gathered the papers with efficient care and said, "You should come to supper. Bert makes a decent stew on Fridays and there is always too much of it. You do not have to feed me," he said. "I know that," she said, which was exactly what he had said to her twice, and the echo of it was deliberate and made him want to smile, which he managed not to do but barely. "I am asking because I would like your company, not as payment." He went to supper on Friday. It was the first time he had eaten at someone else's table in what felt like a very long time, and the Dugan property, what was left of it after Crail's interference, the burned barn, a stark black skeleton at the edge of the yard, was a place with the sense of history soaked into it, the particular atmosphere of land that has been genuinely lived on rather than just managed from a distance. Bert was a short, solid man of perhaps 50, with a face like a friendly relief map, and a habit of talking at great length about everything except himself, and his stew was in fact quite good. They ate at the kitchen table and talked through the evening until the shadows were growing long, and Levi realized he had lost track of time in a way he had not done in years, and he rode home in the blue dark thinking about the firelight through the Dugan kitchen window and the way Clara had laughed at something Bert had said, an easy, unguarded sound that she had not seemed to be producing for anyone's benefit in particular, just a real laugh happening because something was actually funny. He rode home and did not sleep well and told himself it was the spring wind rattling the window and was aware that this was not entirely true. They developed a pattern over the following weeks that neither of them named because naming things had consequences that they were perhaps both approaching carefully. She came to his property twice a week, or he went to hers, and the occasions were always framed around something practical, a question about fence placement, an opinion on hay pricing at the Ridgecrest market, a book she had mentioned and he had managed to locate at the Mercantile where Mrs. Holt kept a small rotating selection of reading material. The practical framings became thinner as the weeks passed, but neither of them challenged the practice of having them. In late May, there was a day when they rode out together across the open country between their respective properties, because she had said she wanted to see where his land met the public range, and she was curious about the geography of the watershed they shared. It was the most purely pleasant day Levi had spent in memory, riding beside her across the wide spring grass, with the sky enormous overhead and her hair escaping its pins in the wind, and the horses moving in easy companionable sync, the way horses do when they have become accustomed to each other. They stopped at the crest of a long, low ridge that gave a view of the valley below, the creek a bright thread through the green, and sat their horses side by side looking at it. "It is beautiful," she said, and she was not performing it. She was simply saying what was true. "Yes," he said. She turned to look at him, and he was already looking at her, and the moment held for a fraction of a second longer than strictly necessary, and then they both looked back at the valley and said nothing. And the thing that had been building between them all these weeks sat right there in the warm May air between their horses, still unnamed, still patient. He helped her when the legal hearings required her to be in Pueblo for 3 days in early June. He could not go with her. His herd needed attending, and 3 days away from the property in early summer was not practical. But he made sure Pete would check in at her property daily while she was gone, and he sent a letter ahead with her to a man he knew in Pueblo, a respectable older rancher named Harlan Grubb who had influence in the county and who could smooth Clara's way if there were difficulties. She had not asked for any of this. She found out about it afterward and came to tell him that Harlan Grubb had been unexpectedly helpful in navigating some of the courthouse bureaucracy, and that when she asked how he knew her situation, he had mentioned a letter from Levi Fairchild. She stood in front of him on his porch in the June sunshine with her hands on her hips and an expression that was caught between gratitude and a mild, warm exasperation. "You wrote to Harlan Grubb without telling me," she said. "I know Harlan Grubb," he said. "He knows how that courthouse works. It seemed useful." "It was useful," she said. "It was also," she stopped, the exasperation softening into something else. "You did not have to do that." "I know," he said, for what felt like the 10th time between them, and this time she laughed because she heard the echo too. The hearing in Pueblo had gone well. Hearst had presented the survey documents cleanly. The judge had reviewed Crail's counterarguments and found them wanting, and a formal ruling was expected within 3 weeks confirming Clara's title to the land without condition. Crail's legal maneuvering was effectively finished. "Is it over?" Levi asked. "The legal part is over," she said. "Crail will be angry. Men like that do not like losing." But Hearst believes he will not act on it. The restraining order put him on the judge's notice, and he has other operations he needs to protect. He is not going to risk them for a quarter section he has already lost through proper channels. She said this confidently, and Levi heard beneath the confidence the careful monitoring of a person who has learned to take nothing entirely for granted. "And the barn," he said. "I have enough from the settlement Hearst negotiated for legal costs to begin rebuilding before the end of summer," she said. "I have already spoken to a carpenter in town." She paused, and something shifted in her expression, something that looked like the weight of the last 8 months beginning very tentatively to let go. "My father would be relieved," she said quietly. "He worried about it toward the end, about what Crail might do, about whether I would be able to manage it. I told him yes, and I meant it, but there were days this spring when I was less certain than I had sounded." "You managed it," Levi said. "I had help," she said, looking at him directly. He held her gaze this time and did not look away, and she did not look away either, and he thought about Alina, not with the old pain but with the clarity that sometimes comes when you are standing somewhere new and can finally see the shape of the place you have been. Alina had wanted something different, and she had gone to find it, and there was nothing wrong with that, and nothing wrong with him for being the thing she left behind. He had built his vow around the wrong lesson. He had decided that the problem was opening, when the problem had simply been that a particular door had led somewhere that was not right for either of them. He thought this clearly and quickly, and then he said, "Clara," and something in the way he said her name made her go very still. "Yes," she said softly. "I was not going to do this," he said. "I had made up my mind about it a long time ago." "About what?" she said, though he thought she knew. "About whether I was going to let someone in again." He said it plainly because he did not know how to say important things any other way. "There was a woman 5 years ago, and it did not end well, and I decided that was a lesson I only needed to learn once." She waited, because she understood how to wait for a person to find the rest of what they need to say. "I think I may have been wrong about that," he said. "I am not certain of many things, but I think I may have been wrong about that." The June light was long and golden on the porch boards between them. Clara looked at him with those honest brown eyes and said, "I am not asking you to be certain. I am not certain of very many things either. My father died and someone tried to take my land, and I have spent most of this year being certain of nothing, except that I was going to fight for what was mine." She paused. "But I am quite certain that Friday's supper is better when you are at the table, and that the survey questions I bring you are sometimes real questions and sometimes an excuse, and that when I am riding home from your property, I am already thinking about when I can come back." Levi Fairchild stood on his own porch in the warm June evening with 5 years of careful solitude around him like a coat he had grown accustomed to wearing, and he said, "I feel the same way," and it was the most accurate thing he had said in a very long time. He reached out and took her hand where it rested on the porch rail, and she turned her hand and held his back, and they stood like that for a moment, not moving toward anything dramatic, just holding on, and it felt like the most significant thing that had happened on his property since he had first put the fence posts in and called it his. Summer on the Colorado Territory prairie was its own particular argument for the beauty of the world, and Levi Fairchild, who had stopped bothering to notice that argument some time ago, found himself noticing it again. He and Clara did not announce anything, because they were both people who moved carefully, and the territory between them was new enough that they were still learning its landmarks. But the shape of things between them changed. He began riding to her property on Sunday mornings without being asked, and she would have coffee waiting, and they would ride the bounds of her land together, checking the creek levels and the fence lines with the comfortable businesslike intimacy of people who share a concern for the same things. She began leaving her horse tied at his gate some evenings without ceremony, and they would sit on his porch until the stars were out and the coyotes were calling from the dark, talking about everything and sometimes nothing. Pete observed all of this with the expression of a young man exercising extraordinary restraint and said nothing. He did, however, increase the thoroughness with which he finished his own work before the evening, giving Levi the clear porch by supper time, which Levi noticed and did not acknowledge. The carpenter Clara had hired a capable man named Morris who had done considerable building in the county over the past decade, began work on the new barn in July. Levi arrived on the first day of construction without being asked and spent the day working alongside Morris and his crew, and Clara brought water out to the workers at midday and found Levi in his shirt sleeves sawing lumber in the July heat with the methodical energy of a man doing something that matters. And she stood for a moment watching him before he looked up and saw her, and the look that passed between them was the kind that requires no translation. By midsummer, the new barn was rising, and Clara's land was peaceful in a way it had not been in more than a year. Crail had made no further moves. The federal ruling had come down confirming her title. Eli had finished his cattle drive and come home, and the first meeting between Clara Dugan and Levi Fairchild had taken place one evening at supper, and Eli was a big-shouldered, open-faced young man of 27 with his father's steady temperament, and enough goodwill toward anyone who had helped his sister that he had shaken Levi's hand with genuine warmth and said, "I hear you are the one who got her to Ridgecrest when she needed to go." "She did that herself," Levi said. "I just rode alongside." Eli had laughed at that, something in it striking him as exactly right, and looked at Clara with a brother's particular knowing expression, and Clara had pointedly changed the subject. On a late August evening they were sitting on the creek bank below Clara's property, the water low and clear after the dry month, the cottonwoods making their warm wind sound overhead. They had been quiet for a while in the comfortable way that had become natural between them, and then Clara said, "What happened with the woman 5 years ago? You do not have to tell me, but I have wondered." He looked at the water. "Her name was Elena. We were going to be married. She left with someone else." He said it simply, without embellishment or bitterness, because those things had burned away over time. "She said the life I was offering was not the life she wanted. I think she was right. I think we were not well matched, and I had not been honest enough with myself about that because I wanted it to work." He paused. "After she left, I decided I was better suited to being alone. I made a whole philosophy of it." "And now?" she asked. He turned to look at her in the evening light. "And now I am wondering if the philosophy was the problem all along and not the love itself." She held his gaze steadily. "I think that is a reasonable thing to wonder." "I am fairly certain of it," he said, and he moved his hand to her face, slowly, giving her time to decide about it, and she leaned into his hand rather than away from it, and he kissed her there beside the creek in the August evening with the cottonwoods above them and the sound of the water below. And it was as unhurried and honest and solid as everything else that had happened between them. When they broke apart, she said quietly, "I think I have been waiting for that since the morning I came through your fence line uninvited." "You could have said something," he said. "You had a wall up," she said, "and I respected it." "I know," he said. "Thank you for being patient with it." "I would have been patient with it for a good while longer," she told him, which was true, and which he knew was true, and which made the evening feel like something he had been given rather than something he had earned, which was perhaps the same thing. Fall came with the particular authority it had in that part of Colorado territory, not gradual but decisive, the days shortening with sudden purpose, and the cottonwoods going gold in a week, and the first real cold coming down from the mountains in a way that meant business. The cattle needed bringing in from the upper pasture, and both Levi's and Clara's operations required the full attention work of preparing for winter. They were busy in the way working land makes you busy, and they saw each other around the edges of that work, and the relationship between them grew with the season deeper rooted by necessity, accustomed to the weight of real life. Eli Dugan, who turned out to be a man of considerable practical value and genuine good humor, had settled back onto the family property with the intention of staying through the winter, and his presence relieved Clara of some of the solitary management she had been carrying since their father died. She seemed lighter for it, not diminished but genuinely relieved in the way of someone who has been carrying something alone for a long time and is glad of a hand to share the weight. One October Saturday, Levi drove into Ridgecrest for supplies and stopped at the small jewelry shop that a man named Caraway operated out of the back room of the watch repair establishment on the main street. He stood at the counter for a few minutes looking at the modest selection. Caraway's was not a grand jeweler's by any measure, but the work was honest and well made, and he chose with the same deliberateness he brought to everything, and put the small parcel in his jacket pocket and finished his errands and drove home. He did not act on it immediately. He had learned something about himself since Clara had come back through his gate that day with news of the legal victory, and what he had learned was that he was still, underneath the years of careful isolation, a man who took things seriously and who moved deliberately precisely because he took them seriously. He needed to be certain. He was almost certain. He gave himself a few more weeks to be sure. In November, with the first real snow on the ground and the mountains white and sharp in the cold air, and the days short and crackling with that particular winter clarity that makes everything seem very present and very true, he drove his wagon to the Dugan property on a Sunday morning and found Clara in the yard feeding the chickens, her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and he climbed down from the wagon seat and said her name. And she looked up at him and knew immediately from the way he said it that this was not a Sunday morning routine call. She handed the feed bucket to Eli, who had appeared in the barn doorway, and Eli took it with the expression of a man who understands that discretion is currently his most useful quality, and she came across the yard to where Levi was standing by the wagon. "What is it?" she said, not worried exactly, but attentive. "I have been thinking," he said, "about the fact that I drive 12 miles every Sunday morning and it is 12 miles back in the evening, and that is 24 miles of riding that I would rather not be doing alone." She was very still. Her brown eyes were steady on his face. "I have been thinking," he continued, "that I built something on my land that is solid and good and that I built it to last, but I built it for one person and it is too large for one person, and it has been too large for 7 years and I have pretended that was fine." "Levi," she said softly. "I am asking you to marry me," he said. "I am asking you plainly because I do not know any other way to ask important things. You know who I am. You have known for several months in all the ways that count, and I know who you are." He reached into his jacket pocket and produced the small parcel and unwrapped it, a simple ring with a single small stone set in worked silver that Caraway had done clean and good. "I would like us to live the same life instead of adjacent ones." Clara Dugan stood in the November yard with chickens clucking around her boots and her brother pretending very hard not to watch from the barn doorway. And she looked at Levi with those honest eyes that had always told him exactly what was true in them, and she said, "Yes." Without any hesitation, Levi. "Yes." He put the ring on her finger, and it fit because he had asked Eli quietly the previous week what size Clara's hands were, and Eli had told him with barely concealed delight, and she saw this in his face somehow and said, "You asked Eli." "I needed to know the size," he said. She laughed, that real and unperformed laugh he had first heard in her own kitchen months ago, and she stepped forward and put her arms around him in the cold November air, and he held her there in the yard with the snow thin on the ground, and the mountains white above the prairie and the enormous sky of the territory overhead. And Eli whooped from the barn doorway in a volume that startled the chickens considerably, and Clara said against his shoulder, "Eli, go back inside." "Absolutely not," Eli called back, but he was grinning. They were married in the Ridgecrest Church in December, on the Saturday before Christmas, when the town was as festive as a working frontier settlement was likely to get, with pine boughs along the mercantile windows and the smell of wood smoke in the cold air. The ceremony was simple, performed by the pastor, a capable and warm-hearted man named Reverend Ames, who had been in the territory long enough to know that the people who came to him to be married had usually done the most important work of the relationship before arriving at the church, and who performed his part accordingly, with genuine feeling and without unnecessary elaboration. Clara wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her by Mrs. Oakes at the Westing house, who had a talent for such things, a cream-colored wool that was practical and beautiful in equal measure. Levi wore his best clothes, which were clean and well-pressed and unmistakably the clothes of a working rancher, and he stood at the front of the small church and watched her walk toward him with Eli at her side, and felt the kind of certainty that comes from knowing you have not made a mistake. Eli gave his sister away with tremendous dignity and only slightly damp eyes. Pete Halley sat in the front pew and looked proud of himself for reasons Levi was not entirely sure he merited, but was willing to forgive. Mrs. Oakes and several of the other women from town filled the pews, and Harlan Grubb had come up from Pueblo specifically for the occasion and sat in the third row looking well pleased with the general state of things. The vows were simple and direct. Levi said his with the same plain precision he brought to everything that mattered, looking at Clara without looking away, and Clara said hers looking back at him with the same honesty she had brought to everything between them since the morning she rode through his fence uninvited. Reverend Ames pronounced them married, and Levi kissed his wife in the small, full church with the December cold pressing at the windows and the people around them warm and present, and it felt like the truest thing he had ever been part of. Winter on the Fairchild property. It was the Fairchild property that became their home, because it was larger and more established, and Clara had said without sentiment that a practical decision should be made practically, though she kept the Dugan land as her own, legally secure and entirely hers, with Eli managing it going forward, was quiet in the way of married winters everywhere. There is a particular intimacy in the cold months when the work is reduced and the evenings are long and the household is shared, in learning how another person takes their coffee, in the small territories of a shared kitchen, in reading beside the same lamp and going to sleep under the same roof and waking to the same winter morning. Clara found the rhythms of the Fairchild house quickly, which surprised neither of them. She was a woman who understood practical systems and absorbed new ones without resistance, and she brought to his home certain things it had not had: a warmth in the details, the smell of baking on Sunday mornings, a string of dried peppers hung in the kitchen for cooking, a green plant she had brought from her own house that sat in the south-facing window and held its own against the February cold with a stubbornness she clearly found admirable. Levi found the rhythms of shared life with something deeper than relief. He had been alone for so long that solitude had become its own kind of noise, a constant low frequency he had stopped hearing. Clara's presence did not fill the house so much as it made the house into something it had only been trying to be. A place where life actually happened, where the work and the quiet and the laughter and the difficult conversations all belonged to people who were choosing to be there, choosing each other, day after repeated day. They had disagreements in that first winter, because two capable and independent people who each have strong opinions about how things should be done will always have disagreements, and the disagreements were real and sometimes heated. Clara had views about the management of the irrigation on the north pasture that differed from his established practice, and she was not shy about saying so. He had views about the frequency with which certain things needed doing in a household that she did not always share. They learned together how to argue productively, to say what was actually the matter without saying it at the highest possible volume, to come back to each other after temper had cooled with the willingness to hear, to find the place where two sets of practical intelligence could work together better than either could alone. In the end, Clara had been right about the north pasture irrigation, and he told her so, and she did not make more of it than it was, which was one of the things he was learning to be grateful for in her, that her rightness about things was never weaponized, just acknowledged and moved on from. Spring came back to the territory with its usual expansive beauty, the land greening after the brown months, and the creek running high and clear with snowmelt, and the world opening back up the way it does every year and always manages to be surprising anyway. Clara found out she was expecting in March. She told Levi on a Sunday morning at the kitchen table, directly, in the way she told him everything without preamble, just the fact, and then her eyes on his face waiting to see what he would do with it. What he did was set his coffee cup down very carefully, as a man does when he needs his hands to be still, and then he reached across the table and took both her hands in his and said, "Are you well?" "I am very well," she said, smiling. "Good," he said. "That is the main thing." And then he said her name, just her name, the way he had said it the day he told her he had built his fence wrong, and she understood from the way he said it that what was underneath it was a joy too large and too newly arrived to fit into more organized words, and she squeezed his hands and said, "I know." He told Pete, who reacted with a volume of enthusiasm that scattered the barn cats. He wrote to Eli, who wrote back within the week with a letter that was 3 pages long and contained twice as many exclamation marks as Levi would have used in 10 years of correspondence, but was genuine in every word. Harlan Grubb sent a bottle of good whiskey from Pueblo with a brief note that said, "Well done, Fairchild," which was about as effusive as Harlan Grubb ever got and carried considerable weight for it. The pregnancy was uncomplicated, which Clara managed with the same calm practicality she brought to most things, though there were weeks in the middle months when she was tired in a way that frustrated her, and she said so without pretending otherwise. Levi arranged the work on the property differently during those months, keeping himself closer to home and making sure that what needed doing on the far pasture was handled by Pete, who rose to the expanded responsibility with the eager competence of a young man who has been waiting for the chance to prove himself. In December, a week before the first anniversary of their wedding, Clara gave birth to a son. The birth was attended by the doctor from Ridgecrest, a measured and experienced man named Dr. Cole, who had been delivering children in the territory for 15 years. And it was long and difficult in the way of first labors, but ultimately, blessedly, without complication. Levi sat in the front room of his own house and was the bravest he had been in his adult life, which meant he was very frightened and very still, and did not show either of those things to anyone. When Dr. Cole came to the door and said, "Mother and son both doing well," Levi sat very still for one more moment and then stood up and said, "Thank you," in a voice that was not entirely steady, which was the most anyone was going to get from him in the direction of visible emotion, and which Dr. Cole, who had delivered children to men like Levi Fairchild across 30 years and 4 territories, understood completely. They named the boy Thomas for Clara's father. It felt right and necessary in a way that required no discussion. Thomas Fairchild arrived in the world with his mother's brown eyes and the fine beginnings of his father's fair coloring, and from his first hours in the house on the Fairchild property, he seemed entirely at ease with the arrangement, which his parents found deeply reassuring. Christmas that year was different from any Levi had experienced in adult memory. The house warm and full, Clara recovered and sitting in the chair by the fire with Thomas in her arms. Eli arrived from the Dugan property for the holiday, and filling the kitchen with noise and the smell of the awful tobacco he had recently acquired a taste for and been asked to confine to the porch. Pete invited to Christmas dinner for the first time, and clearly moved by the invitation. In a way, he was working very hard not to show. Levi stood in his own kitchen on Christmas evening with the food on the table and the people around it who mattered most to him, and he thought about the morning 4 years ago when a woman had come through his fence line uninvited, and he thought about the vow he had been so certain of, the careful architecture of his alone life, and he thought that he had been so very wrong and he was so very glad of it. After dinner, when Eli and Pete were doing their noisy and mutually agreeable best to handle the washing up, and Clara was nursing Thomas in the quiet of the front room, Levi sat beside her in the firelight, and she leaned her head against his shoulder and said, "Merry Christmas, Levi." "Merry Christmas," he said, and looked at his son's small face and his wife's tired and contented expression, and the fire burning in the hearth of the house he had built for one and that had always been trying to be more than that, and felt something settle in him all the way down to the ground, the way a fence post settles when it is properly set, final, deep, meant to hold. The years that followed on the Fairchild property had the quality of things built right. They did not need drama to sustain them. There were the ordinary crises of working land in the territory. A bad summer 2 years after Thomas was born when the drought came hard, and the creek ran low, and the cattle needed driving further north to find water, and Levi and Pete and 2 extra hands spent 3 weeks sleeping on the trail, while Clara managed the home operation with Eli's help and her own considerable capability. There was the year the roof needed replacing, and they did it together over 2 weeks in September, Levi and Pete up in the heat, Clara below directing the material supply with military precision, and Thomas, now a small and surprisingly opinionated person, following along with his own tiny commentary on the proceedings. 2 years after Thomas, Clara had a daughter. They named her Margaret, for no particular grand reason except that Clara had always liked the name, and it suited her when she arrived. A small, alert, determined-looking child who from her first weeks seemed to have made a decision about how things were going to be. Thomas regarded his sister with the initial suspicion of a firstborn, and within a month, the proprietorial devotion of one. The Dugan land continued under Eli's management, and Eli proved to have the same steadiness and practical gift their father had possessed, gradually improving the operation and expanding carefully. He married a woman named Rose from a neighboring county in 1878, a schoolteacher of bright intelligence and dry humor who became Clara's closest friend within a year of arriving in the family. And together, they made something on the Dugan property that Thomas Dugan would have recognized and been proud of. Levi watched his children grow in the way that men who love their families deeply and quietly do, present, consistent, capable of expressing the large things in small, steady actions. He taught Thomas to ride when the boy was 4 and was at his horse's side every day of the learning, patient in a way that Clara sometimes said looked so entirely unlike his usual self that she suspected him of deliberate strategy, which he denied, unconvincingly. Thomas had his mother's determination, and the particular Fairchild stubbornness that meant that once he decided something was possible, he was committed to it in a way that made failure almost structurally difficult. He was, by 6, a decent hand with a rope. Margaret was something else again. She had taken her father's quietness and her mother's precision and combined them into a person of few words and remarkable effectiveness. She had no interest in roping but considerable interest in the planting. Clara had begun expanding on the south end of the property, a kitchen garden that had grown over the years into a serious operation that supplemented the cattle operation handsomely, and that Margaret approached with a scientist's delight, running small experiments in seed spacing and irrigation that produced results she reported to her father with great seriousness, and that Levi received with the exact gravity they deserved. Pete Halley, who had been with Levi since before Clara arrived, and who had watched the whole transformation of the Fairchild property from a well-kept but solitary operation into a full and living household, had not been wrong that first morning when he said the word, and then retreated to the north fence. He had been on the property for 8 years by the time of Margaret's birth, and had been offered a partnership stake that he had accepted with the same slightly overwhelmed sincerity with which he had been offered Christmas dinner, and he was genuinely part of the operation in all the ways that mattered. He met a young woman from Ridgecrest in 1879, a capable and cheerful person named Dora who worked at the mercantile, and who took an immediate liking to Pete's quiet nature and general reliability, and they married in the spring of 1880 in the same church where Levi and Clara had been married 6 years before, and Levi and Clara sat in the front pew and looked at each other with the look of people who know something good when they see it. On a spring morning in 1881, Levi Fairchild was out by the east pasture checking the fence line. There was always something to check on the east fence. It was the nature of that particular stretch of ground, and he stopped at the point where, 7 years ago, a rail had come loose in the night and a woman had ridden through without permission. And he looked at the solid and well-maintained fence in front of him and felt the particular quiet pleasure of a man standing in his own life and recognizing it as exactly what he would have chosen. He heard horses coming from the direction of the house, and turned to see Clara riding toward him with Thomas up behind her on the saddle, and Margaret on her own small pony, moving alongside with the careful concentration of a child, who is still negotiating the relationship between intention and outcome on horseback. Clara was 35 now and had been his wife for 7 years and the person he knew best in the world, and she was still the woman who had looked at him across a desperate spring morning with those honest eyes and refused to let him minimize what she owed him. She pulled up alongside the fence, following his gaze to the east rail section. "That the spot?" She asked because he had told her the story in the way he told things gradually and without drama over the years. "That is the spot," he said. Thomas, who was 6 and at the age where everything was a question, said, "What spot?" "The place where Mama came through the fence without asking," Levi said. "You can do that?" Thomas asked with immediate practical interest. "No," Clara said firmly. "Your mother had an emergency," Levi said. "It was an emergency," Clara agreed, "and it was also rude, and I have thought of a better way to handle it when it happens to you." "When what happens to me?" "When you think you have an emergency." She looked at Levi over their son's head with the expression that was entirely hers, that blend of love and humor and clear-eyed practicality that he had been cataloging for 7 years and expected to spend the next several decades still discovering new variations of. "There is almost always a gate." "There is always a gate," Levi agreed. Margaret, who had brought her pony to a stop beside her mother's horse with the focused satisfaction of a successful piece of riding, looked at the fence section and then at her parents and said, "But she did not use the gate." "No," Levi said. "And then you married her," Margaret said. "Yes." Margaret considered this. "So not using the gate worked out all right," she said. "Margaret," Clara said, with feeling. But Levi was smiling, that rare and genuine smile that Clara had worked years to understand, was not rare because he was withholding it, but rare because it was reserved for the moments that genuinely earned it, and that meant when it arrived it was the realest thing in the room. He reached up and lifted Thomas from behind Clara's saddle and settled the boy on his own shoulders, Thomas immediately grabbing his father's hat with both hands for balance, which dislodged it, which resulted in a negotiation about the hat that Thomas lost on every available count and seemed unbothered by. Clara watched him settle the hat back on his head and look up at Thomas with that expression she had first seen in the church on their wedding day and had seen every day since in some form, the particular look of a man who has understood what it means to be grateful for the specific life he is living. "Come back for lunch," she said. "Bert sent potatoes from the Dugan farm with Eli yesterday, the good ones." "We are coming," he said. She turned her horse toward the house, Margaret's small pony falling in alongside, and Levi stood in the spring morning with his son on his shoulders, and the solid east fence in front of him, and the house behind him, warm and particular and real. And he thought about the vow he had made once in the wreckage of something that had not been right for either party, and he thought about what had become of it when a woman with honest eyes and a desperate horse had come through a gap in his fence uninvited. And he thought that the wreckage of wrong things sometimes made exactly the right foundation for something better, if you were willing to stop standing guard over the ruins long enough to let someone in. He turned and followed his family home. The property had good years and difficult ones after that, the way all working land does when you stay with it long enough. There was a winter in the mid-1880s when the cattle prices fell badly, and they had to think very carefully about the operation. And they thought about it together at the kitchen table the way they thought about everything, seriously and without panic. And they came through it with the discipline that had always characterized how Levi ran things, and the creative problem-solving that Clara brought when the straightforward solution was not available. Pete and Dora had 2 children of their own by then, a boy and a girl, and the Halley cabin on the western edge of the Fairchild property was another light at night and another table that the Fairchild children visited as freely as their own. Thomas grew into a young man with his father's build and his mother's quick intelligence, and he stayed on the land because he chose to, not because there was nothing else, and that choice mattered to both his parents in different ways. Margaret, who had spent her childhood running quiet experiments in the South Garden and reading every book that could be acquired within a day's ride of Ridgecrest, went east for a time to study, a decision her parents supported with the whole of what they had, because the territory was large and the world was larger, and she was the kind of person who needed to understand both. She came back in her own time, and when she came back all the way, bringing with her a man named Samuel who was a geologist and who looked at the Colorado Territory land with the same reverence with which Margaret looked at it. And they settled not far from the Fairchild property, and the family expanded further in the natural way of things. Eli and Rose on the Dugan land remained their nearest neighbors and dearest friends, and the connection between the 2 properties, the Dugan quarter section that Clara had fought for and won, the Fairchild land that Levi had built and kept, remained as solid as the fence line between them, which was maintained with great regularity by multiple generations and never once came loose in the east section again. In the late spring of a year when the territory was becoming something that maps were getting more confident about, when Ridgecrest Flats had grown into a proper small town with a real school and a second church, and a doctor who had been there long enough to have delivered most of its younger citizens, Levi Fairchild sat on the wide porch of his house in the evening with his wife beside him, and the mountains lit gold-pink above the purple shadow of the valley. And the sound of Thomas working somewhere near the barn drifted to them in the warm air, and the particular piece of a life that has been built and tended and chosen every day for more than a decade settled around them like something earned. Clara had her hand in his, as she often did in the evenings, not as a declaration but because it was where it had ended up and where it was comfortable, and she was looking at the mountains with the reflective expression of a woman thinking through something pleasantly unhurried. "Do you ever think about where we would have ended up if I had taken the regular trail into town that morning?" she asked. It was the kind of question that arises in long marriages, the contemplation of the narrow places where things could have gone differently and did not. Levi was quiet for a moment. The evening breeze moved through the cottonwoods he had planted years ago along the south edge of the property, and they made their particular sound. "You would have found another way," he said. "You are that kind of person." She turned to look at him. "What kind?" "The kind who finds a way," he said. "The kind who does not stop." He looked at the mountains. "I am less sure about myself. I might have stayed exactly as I was for a very long time." "I think you would have found your way eventually," she said, with the quiet confidence of someone who has known a person completely and has thought about who they actually are rather than who they seem to be at first encounter. "Perhaps," he said. "But not with you, and that would have been the real loss." She looked at him for a long moment with those honest brown eyes that he had first seen in the slant morning light of a spring day when she pulled her tired horse up in his east pasture, and he looked back at her the way he always looked at things he had decided to keep straight on, without reservation. "I love you, Levi," she said simply. "I love you," he said with the same simplicity, because that was how he said the things that were most true, without surrounding them, without ornamentation, just the plain fact of them, clean and solid and meant to last. The evening light moved across the mountains and the valley below, and the good land that stretched between them, and on the porch of the house he had built for one that had always been trying to be more. Levi Fairchild sat with his wife and held her hand in the Colorado evening, and the fence post in the east pasture held firm, and the gate at the front of the property stood open the way it had stood for years now, because there was no longer any need to keep the world at a distance. And everything that had come through, it had only made the life inside it larger and better and more completely, abundantly real.